Here we want to talk for a few minutes about the components of blood. And if you take a look at the image that's on the screen here, what you see is the result of a procedure that's called centrifugation. If you take a sample of blood, place it into a small test tube, and then place that tube into a centrifuge is basically a machine that spins around very quickly, and it allows all the heavier components of blood to settle out toward the bottom, while all the lighter components, the ones that are lighter in mass, stay toward the top. And you're going to see two predominant areas. The first, the top area here, consists of something called plasma. Plasma is the liquid extracellular matrix of blood. Now you have to keep in mind, blood is a connective tissue. And when you look at any connective tissue, it's going to have two major parts. You're going to have the extracellular matrix, and you're also going to have the cells. And in the case of blood, we need to also say cell fragments. So the plasma is a liquid extracellular matrix of blood. It accounts for about 55% of the total blood volume. It's usually described as having a yellow straw color to it, and you can see that represented here in the diagram. Toward the bottom of the tube would be a collection of what we refer to collectively as formed elements. These are the cells and cell fragments of blood. So you have plasma, the liquid extracellular matrix, and then your formed elements, which are the cells and cell fragments. Collectively, the formed elements account for about 45% of the total blood volume. These formed elements include red blood cells, white blood cells, and also platelets. And we're going to talk about each one of those individually as we go through the chapter, so you can kind of see the references here. The majority of those formed elements will be red blood cells, while the platelets and white blood cells make up a minority, but they are still also present, obviously. So let's talk for a little bit here about plasma, that liquid extracellular matrix of blood, because one of the things that you have to know for your test is what exactly we find in plasma. So I'm going to make this image that we have here a little bit bigger so we can use the breakdown here to talk about plasma. As I told you a few moments ago, plasma accounts for about 55% of your total blood volume. Now, when we look at the makeup of plasma, the majority of it is going to be water. You don't have to remember that water is 91.5% of plasma. I'm not going to ask you that number, but you should remember the concept, and that concept is this, that plasma is mainly water. So mainly, predominantly water. That's what we find in plasma. But remember, I told you it has a yellow straw color to it. So obviously there's stuff dissolved in plasma that helps give it that yellow straw color. So let's talk about that. I'm going to start down here at this bottom box where it says other solutes. These other solutes are obviously important. And if you look over here to the right hand side, you can see what some of these are. Now for the purposes of your quiz and test, you need to know examples of each one of these categories. So let's start out here by talking about the electrolytes first. The electrolytes are basically ions. When you think about sodium ions, potassium ions, chloride ions, calcium ions, magnesium ions, and the list could go on from there. That's what we mean by electrolytes. You hear it commonly referred to if you talk about sports drinks like Gatorade or Powerade. So electrolytes, they're just various ions found within blood. That's one of the other solutes. Next, we have nutrients. Nutrients include things like vitamins. There's water-soluble vitamins. They usually talk to you about that if you look at if you take nutrition. But I suppose for our purposes, the main nutrient that I would tell you to keep in mind would be glucose. And of course, we mentioned glucose during our discussion with the endocrine system, and it should be pretty obvious that glucose is a nutrient. Next, we have gases. Two gases that the human body commonly deals with on a daily basis, oxygen and carbon dioxide. To a certain degree, both are found dissolved in plasma. Now, there is a possibility that there could be other gases such as nitric oxide or even carbon monoxide, but that's a whole other situation, and we'll get into that a little bit when we start up with the red blood cell discussion. Next, we have regulatory substances. We spent all of Chapter 18 discussing regulatory substances. Those predominantly are going to be hormones. And then finally, we have waste products. Waste products meaning things that your body needs to eliminate. We can include carbon dioxide in that umbrella, or we could go and include things like urea or ammonia. These are going to all be examples of what we refer to collectively as nitrogenous waste, and those nitrogenous waste are going to fall up underneath this waste product category. So, for the purposes, once again, of your quiz or test, you need to be able to recognize not only the category, but also know some examples. Now let's go back up to the top and talk about the area that I kind of skipped over here, and that's proteins. Collectively, we call these plasma proteins, and there's a few key facts that you need to keep in mind about them. The first of those is going to be where most of them are produced. Most of these plasma proteins are produced by your liver. So your liver plays a very key role in obviously making them, because that's where most of them will come from. The roles of these plasma proteins are variable. They can be involved in everything from blood clotting to hormone transportation, and also they play a major role in fluid balance within the body. So some of these proteins include items such as albumins, which come predominantly from the liver, globulins, and there's many different forms of those, but some of them are involved in immune responses, some of them are transport proteins, it's all variable. And fibrinogen as well. Fibrinogen is going to be involved in blood clotting, and we'll talk about that later on in this particular chapter. So, you got several plasma proteins. Many of them come from the liver, not all, but many of them. They play several different key roles, everything from immune responses to blood clotting to hormone transportation, and the list will go on. Keep in mind that they are also critically important in maintaining fluid balance. Why is this? We'll discuss it in chapter 21, but to give you a little bit of foreshadowing, when we look at how nutrients and waste are exchanged between your blood and tissues, part of that exchange involves the movement of fluid. Well, it's the plasma proteins that help your blood vessels pick back up the fluid that contains the waste. If you don't have enough plasma proteins, then you wouldn't be able to do that. So, that's a quick summary of what you would find in plasma. Like I said, keep in mind some examples of the other solutes, the fact that it is mainly water, and then when we look at those plasma proteins, you should definitely know many of them come from the liver, and that they also play a role in your body's ability to maintain fluid balance. Now, if we scroll to the bottom of the image here, we're going to take a very quick look here at the formed elements. And I say quick look because we're going to touch on each one of these formed elements individually as we go through the chapter, so I don't feel the need to spend a whole lot of time on them. But as I told you before, the formed elements are cells and cell fragments found within blood. They consist of three major categories. You have red blood cells, and their main job is to allow you to transport gases, principally oxygen. Then you would have white blood cells. White blood cells are primarily involved in immune responses. And then you'd also have platelets. Platelets are the reason we have to say cell fragments, because platelets are not technically cells. They're fragments of a cell, and those platelets are going to be involved in blood clotting. Now, if you look at the chart here, you can see that they pulled out to the far right-hand side the 5 different categories of white blood cells. These will include neutrophils. They're the most dominant white blood cell in a normal individual, accounting for anywhere from 60 to 70% of all white blood cells. Lymphocytes would be the next most common white blood cell, accounting for 20 to 25%, followed by monocytes, then eosinophils, and finally basophils. Now, I'll remind you when we do the white blood cell discussion, but you should keep in mind what the relative numbers of each white blood cell are. That means you should know which one is the most to the least numerous. And there's a little easy mnemonic to try and deal with that. It goes, never let monkeys eat bananas. It gives you the first letter of each white blood cell in the order that they occur, from the most to the least numerous. So never would be for neutrophils, let for lymphocytes, monkeys for monocytes, eat for eosinophils, and bananas for basophils. And if you can remember that little mnemonic, you'll be able to keep them straight. At some point, you're likely to see me ask you, which of the white blood cells is the most numerous, or which is the least numerous, or something like that. And that would be beneficial in that situation. Now, just for a quick moment, since it is at this point in our outline, I want to talk to you about the total blood volume occupied by your red blood cells. It's really a percentage count, and that term that we use is called a hematocrit, Hematocrit. A hematocrit, as I kind of told you, is a percentage count. It's a measure of the percentage of red blood cells. So we take a look at that overall formed element count and the percent of red blood cells that make that up. We refer to that once again as the hematocrit. Now, I'm mentioning this because if we look at it, we have terms that apply to abnormalities in the hematocrit. Are they necessarily negative? Not necessarily, but regardless, they are abnormalities, so we do address them. The first refers to a low hematocrit, and that will be referred to as an anemia. And I'll come back a little bit later and give you some reasons why an anemia exists, but you should understand for right now that an anemia is a low hematocrit. By contrast, the opposite would be a polycythemia. A polycythemia is a high hematocrit. So you got two terms that relate to two different abnormalities as far as the hematocrit. One for a low hematocrit, an anemia. One for a high hematocrit, a polycythemia.